I always thought that executives at any company should be customers of their company, and they should be regular old customers.
A relationship with the right referral partner could be a game changer for any B2B company. So what if you could reverse engineer these relationships at a moment's notice? Start a podcast, invite potential referral partners to be guests on your show, and grow your referral network faster than ever. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Ignorance may be bliss, but it's not defensible in court. Right now on the B2B Growth Show, we're going to spend some time with Sharon Torek, an intellectual property and marketing law attorney who's going to help us stay on the right side of the law as we look to build awareness, earn customers, and grow our businesses. My name is Ethan Beute. I host the CX series here on the B2B Growth Show, and here's our conversation. Hey, welcome back to the Customer Experience Podcast. This is going to be a fun episode. You will be glad that you clicked play on this one. Our guest has run social media and digital marketing at companies with household names like McDonald's, Humana, Discover. He's the author of the book, Winning at Social Customer Care. He's the co-host of Experience This, another customer experience podcast, which he co-hosts with my guest on episode 15 of this podcast, Joey Coleman. And he's the chief experience officer at the company Winning Customer Experience. Dan Gingiss, welcome to the Customer Experience Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation and can't wait to get started.
Yeah, me too. And so we'll start where I always start, which is your thoughts or your definition or the primary characteristics of customer experience. When I say customer experience, what does that mean to you?
Well, to me, it means how customers feel about every single interaction with your brand. And the two underlines there are the feeling part, because perception is reality. And so if we think we've built the best mobile app in the world and our designers and our programmers and everybody tells us that it's the best mobile app in the world, but our customers say that it's really difficult to use, then the answer is it's really difficult to use. The other part, though, is the every single interaction. And this is where I think most companies fall down, is that every single interaction can mean everything from a direct mail piece to a phone call to a social media interaction to the website to the mobile app to an in-store experience. And the problem is that all of those experiences at most big companies are designed by different people in a very siloed organization. And then the result is that we as customers sort of feel this choppiness where things don't align or don't connect as well as we would like them to. So those are the two things to me that make up the definition that are really critical.
It's great. And something that you made me think about there in the back half of that is that one weakness, like a chain is as strong as its weakest link or whatever, just one weakness in all of that set of touch points casts potentially negative thoughts and feelings, and then ultimately potentially negative stories about the entire experience, even though, 80% of it is spot on, the 20% that isn't can really damage the rest.
For sure. And I think that's the biggest risk today, is that it really only takes one mistake sometimes to lose a customer. And so the stakes are really high. One of the things that I have found really fascinating, and this is what I often talk about on stage and work with clients on, is that people are actually, the research shows that people are actually more willing to share highly positive experiences than they are negative ones. But the problem is, and ask any consumer, we just don't have very many positive experiences to show. And so I love doing this on stage. I'll say, hey, raise your hand if you can remember the last time you had such a remarkable experience with a brand that you couldn't wait to tell your friends and family. And, 4 hands go up. And then I say, okay, now raise your hand if you remember the last time that you were disappointed in an experience with a company, and everybody's hands go up. So we tend to share these disappointments because they happen to us a lot, and they are sort of on one end of the spectrum that's worth sharing because they're good stories. But we're actually more willing to share those positive ones if we just had some positive ones to share. And so I love to explore with companies, how do you create those positive ones that people want to share just as much as the negative ones and actually change that sentiment?
Great. And that just leads right into, for anyone listening, I create outlines of these conversations. I try to keep them loose, but I do have places I want to go with them. And so this actually goes right into the next question I kind of generated prior to our connecting here, which is like, how are people operationalizing customer experience? Like, in addition to speaking and writing and doing podcasting, you consult, so you're inside these organizations. Like, what does a consulting engagement look like for you? What do people need? How are companies operationalizing and creating this kind of alignment and consistency within their organizations? What does that look like today?
Well, first of all, I don't claim to be able to knock down all the silos, because that can be an impossible task. But usually what I find is that there's 2 ways to approach the problem. The simplest, fastest way, and the way that I always suggest that you start, is to identify the pain points that are there today and to get rid of them. And oftentimes companies get so wrapped up in innovation and big technology projects that the queue to get little projects done is so long, they just never get done. And so one of the things I did when I was at Discover that was really successful is I managed to essentially grab a person from the technology team. And I said, I'm just going to rent this person for like 3 weeks. And all the person did was work on little pain points. At the time, it was the website, just little things that we had identified that we knew were angering customers because they were frustrating. And they were so easy to fix, but we just never could get them prioritized next to these giant innovation projects. So in the span of 3 weeks, we fixed about 100 things. And not one of them was big enough to knock the whole thing down, but 100 little changes made a huge impact. And not coincidentally, that was the first year that Discover won the J.D. Power Award for highest customer satisfaction, an award that they were really pursuing because Amex had won it, all 7 years of its existence. And if you think about it, Amex is this big, highly respected brand. Discover is a much smaller brand, Midwest, different kind of a customer base. And to win that award was a huge deal. And I absolutely attribute it to spending that time removing the pain points. Then I think you take a look at the flip side of it and you say, all right, how do we make our experience just that much better? And one of the things that I love talking about is the word extraordinary, which really only means better than ordinary. It doesn't mean that you have to do something that is like sending a man to the moon, right? It doesn't have to be crazy expensive. It doesn't have to be outlandish. It just has to be a little bit better than ordinary. And in an industry like credit cards, which is frankly pretty commoditized, there's some great opportunities to do things that are a little bit better than ordinary. A couple things that I think Discover did that were great examples of this. They have the only call center that is, or they have multiple call centers, but they're the only credit card company in the US that has 100% US based service. So what they started doing was they asked every agent when they picked up the phone to tell the customer where they were. So, hi, this is Dan from Chicago. How can I help you? And what was absolutely unbelievable is if you listen to these calls, 9 times out of 10, the very first thing out of the mouth of the customer was something about the location that person was sitting in. It was either, oh, I love Chicago, or how is the weather, or even as direct as, oh, thank goodness I'm talking to somebody in the United States. So it drew out and it created this immediate connection with the customer. And for years they had US service. They just never did that extra thing to sort of make the customer aware of it. And once they made that change, every conversation was sort of forever altered. And so it's get rid of the pain points and then figure out the parts that you can go just a little bit above ordinary. And that's when you really start to kind of get that ball rolling downhill and the momentum going of a great experience.
So good. I love your definition of extraordinary. And I separated those intentionally. Extraordinary, just a little bit extra, little something extra. And this idea of, in this case, there's a real and perceived value to having US-based service. But even if that's not a point of contention for anyone listening, just the idea of opening the call with something a little bit personal that you and I can talk about. In this case, geography is pretty easy to talk about. Weather's the easiest. It's why we often start there. But, and ask questions like, what do you do for a living? But just opening the call with something that we can connect on as people is just a great tip. Can you go one step deeper on one of those things, though? So pain points, I think the first thing that comes to mind, two things come to mind, but I'm sure you, with your depth of experience, will offer maybe one more or add some color to what I'm about to suggest. One is have one or more people, multiple people on the team go through the process to find out where the pain is, because we created this process or this website or this function or whatever months or even years ago, and no one's been back since, right? So it hasn't been reviewed since it's been created or defined. And so send people through it on some consistent cadence and identify pain points that way. Another way, of course, would be some level of customer feedback. But I wonder if customer feedback gets specific enough, I guess you would find emergent themes about really big pain points. But just go one step deeper for folks listening to get practical about how to identify pain points.
Yeah, that's a great question. And both of your answers are correct. You have to sort of do them in combination. So I found I was at Discover almost 10 years. And when I first got there, it was suggested to me that I sign up for an employee card. And I said, why do I want an employee card? And they said, well, you get this benefit and you get this benefit. And then when you call customer service, they know that you're an employee. I don't want them to know I'm an employee. That's exactly what I don't want, right? Because I don't want to be treated differently from a regular customer. And so I declined the employee card. And I always thought that executives at any company should be customers of their company, and they should be regular old customers. You don't want the red siren alarm to go off when the CEO calls into the call center. You want that person to be treated just like everybody else so that they can hear it and feel it and experience it. So I always recommend that you become a customer of your own products. Sometimes that's harder than other times. When I worked at Humana, I wasn't eligible for Medicare Advantage, so I couldn't really sign up for it. But, signing up for a dental plan or doing something, trying to sign up, at least going through the process is really important. And then you mentioned voice of the customer, which is also critical. And there are definite ways where you can capture that. I'll tell you a story that I thought was really instructive, again, back at Discover. So on Discover's website, on every page, they used a survey mechanism, and there's a bunch of them out there. They happen to use one called Opinion Lab. And basically at the bottom of every page, unobtrusive, it's not a pop-up. There just is like a little icon that you can leave your comment about that page. And when you click on the icon, it asks you a couple of quick multiple choice questions, and then it gives you a place for feedback. Now, I got a report every day on the feedback that we got, and we got hundreds of pieces of feedback every day. That's what happens when you have 50 million logins a month, right? You get lots of feedback. And you're right, sometimes the big issues would just pop out, and you'd see it 10 times in one day, and you'd identify it, it was a problem. But more often, there were little things simmering under the surface that if you weren't putting together those daily reports and sort of tracking some trends, it was really tough to find. So one of the things we did is we asked a question in the multiple choice section. We asked a question that came directly from the Forrester Customer Experience Index, which was, how easy was it to do business with us today on a scale of 1 to 10? And I then asked for a report that had never been generated before. I said, I want to see a list of every page in reverse order of the answer to that question. I want to see the pages that people say are the most difficult. And then I want to explore the comments associated with those pages. Now, the page that rose to the very top, the most difficult page on the site, according to our customers, was actually a super important page for us. It was the refer a friend page. It was, introduce someone to Discover and we'll give you $50. I'm like, man, what's wrong with this page? I went and looked at it. I didn't see anything wrong. So we dig into the comments, and it turns out that for one specific browser, the submit button was not showing up. So people were filling out their names and their email addresses of their friends, and then they were stuck. And this was obviously annoying. We fixed that overnight. And sure enough, the next day, those scores on ease of use popped right back up. And that's what sort of gave me this idea of, let's go find the next 100 things that are wrong and just fix all of those, because they're not hard, but you do have to discover them. And so, no pun intended. So I think it is about you have to have the right system in place to capture the feedback. And then you've got to be able to go beyond reporting. And one of the things I find that is a big mistake is you ask companies, well, do you listen to the voice of the customer? Oh yeah, I get this report every day. Well, a report doesn't fix anything, right? And I can tell you from sitting in the chair, when I get a daily report, number one, most days of the week, I don't even have time to read it. So they start stacking up. And then when you have 10 of them, there's no way you're reading 10 of these reports. So it's not effective just to be sending out a daily report to people, because nothing gets done. You have to get it that step forward, that next step where it says, okay, we've got to identify these issues and then have the ability to fix it. And again, that second piece was critical. Is I had to figure out a way to get past the big queue in technology and actually have somebody be willing to go fix these things. And it turned out that was a great project and very successful.
I love that story, and I recognize the pain in having all this really valuable information, but not being quite sure how to harness the resources internally. And I think this gets to the big challenge of customer experience inside organizations and breaking down the silos, which you as this kind of objective third party that comes in, to assess and diagnose and discover and, prescribe and things like that can't do on your own. That's what you said earlier, like I can't break down the silos. It's just too much. It's a different thing. And it's even hard for people internally to do. It's, if this is something produced throughout and across the entire organization, how can we work within these silos to get it done? And just, the idea that you had to take someone out of an existing role speaks to the way that we're not really structured to get a lot of this important work done. And we need to figure that out. I want to go to social media. Just in the title of your book, you're obviously blending social and customer experience. Obviously, social is inherent in some ways to the customer experience, but can you speak to your view of how are those two integrated? Where does social fit into this picture?
So I actually believe that the advent of social media is why we're talking about customer experience so much today, because social media gave customers a voice that they never had before. And shockingly, they use that voice, right? And so thus, we're now all focused on listening to that customer and trying to respond. I look at it as sort of a circular relationship. So I'm a believer that, again, with the advent of social media, there's no longer such a thing as an offline experience. Just ask a certain airline that got caught dragging a guy off a plane. And, you realize that, man, it used to be that when we were on a plane, that was like the ultimate offline experience. And now even that isn't offline anymore. And so everything can come online. And therefore, we as companies, even we as social media teams, we have to know enough to be dangerous about every part of the experience, because any part fails and you're probably going to find out about it on social media. In several of my jobs, I have found out that the website was down from Twitter. Before even the internal technology people know, it's like your customers are going to tell you. The flip side, then, the other part of the circle is that how we respond to people talking to us on social media feeds right back into that experience. So if we are responsive and empathetic and we can resolve problems, we can often turn detractors into advocates. And I've seen that happen tons of times. You start with an angry customer who really doesn't expect you to solve their problem. They just want to vent. And then all of a sudden their problem is solved and they love you. The opposite is true too, is that if you have a customer, either an angry customer or frankly, a very happy customer who reaches out to you and you ignore them, now you've changed their opinion of you, and that feeds back into their overall experience. So to me, social, I got into it as a marketer. The first thing I realized about it was, I don't think this is another broadcast channel, which is what brands did when it first came out. I mean, I remember being in conversations. How about we put our TV commercial on Facebook? It's like, well, wait a minute. I fast forward to the TV commercial on my television. Why do you think I want to see it on Facebook? That's not what I want to see, but that's what people immediately thought, that, hey, this is a free channel where we can broadcast our message to the masses. And instead, I think what happened is it became the first marketing channel where customers could talk back. And that changed everything, because they did talk back and they gave feedback and they said, stop with these commercials. We don't want to see these. Or when you interrupted their Facebook feed, it reminded them that they had been meaning to call you about some completely different issue. And so then they type in their problem, even though it has nothing to do with the marketing piece you just put in front of them. So it changed everything. And that's why I've loved I love social media anyway, but I love the interaction of social and customer experience, because I think they are really sort of two sides to the same coin, if you will.
Yeah, it was super important in my career. I was in broadcast television. I ran marketing teams inside local TV stations. And so you need to occasionally do the events like a parade. There's very little customer interaction. You're just like, hi, people over there on the curb. And you'd go to like festivals and events where you would maybe talk to people, but there's so little customer feedback except for research, which is all anonymized and lumped together. And so I remember I was still in television when social was on the come up, and this idea of people, A, being able to talk about whatever you're talking about, and then B, talking about things that have absolutely nothing to do with what you're talking about, but you still need to find the right home to participate with it. So obviously the rise of social changed all of this. And I agree with you that yeah, this does look like a marketing channel. No, actually, this looks like something a lot more important. But let's get a little bit more nuanced. How have you seen that kind of change maybe over the past 5 years or so? Like what are some of the changes that you're seeing happening in social, for better, for worse, for neither, that has an impact on maybe the way companies are engaging with customers?
Well, I think the biggest change has been that social media as a service channel started off as the channel of last resort. So I had already called and was put on hold for an hour, or I emailed and they didn't respond, or my chat session took forever, or whatever. And I'm already really frustrated because some other customer service channel has failed me. So now I'm going to go to social. But I think what's happened over time is that people realized that engaging with brands on social is actually quite pleasant, and it's fast. There is no hold time like there is, when you're sitting on the phone, because you can tweet and go about your day and come back and see the response, whenever it's convenient for you. And as companies sort of quickly funded and resourced social media, what happened is they put some really good service agents on this channel, and people started figuring out, man, I can get my problem resolved really well on this channel. I'll tell you that I go to social always first now. It's my channel of first resort. And I think that's really the trend that has happened. And it's because, for me anyway, it's the most convenient, fastest, most pleasant service channel that there is out there. I think the other thing that has happened, and the other trend that we're seeing happening right now, is actually this move from what I'll call public social to private social, which is to sort of these messaging apps and Facebook Messenger and Twitter DM and WeChat and all these things. And this is a really nice trend for both customers and companies. Companies, of course, love it because the complainers are now taking their complaints off line, so to speak, out of the public sphere. So so the PR people can relax a little bit, and companies don't have to be so afraid of complaints. Customers like it because, again, it's a very fast, convenient channel. The entire history is there. So, you find yourself not having to repeat your problem or even repeat your loyalty number or whatever it is, your identifier, because all you got to do is scroll up and you shared it a while ago. And so you can just continue the conversation. I've had an ongoing conversation with American Airlines for, a year or two now, where it's like every time I have a question or I've got an issue or I want them to look something up for me, I just go back and they know me and it's so easy, way better than calling or anything like that. So I do think that's a nice trend, again, for both parties. And that's probably the second thing that has happened. I think, again, the third thing is the one that hasn't quite happened yet, but that I'm pushing for and that I really hope happens is this move towards positivity and the ability to change the sentiment by, as we used to say at McDonald's, creating more lovers than haters, or making the lovers louder than the haters. And of course, by creating experiences that people want to share positively with friends and family and followers, and sort of drowning out some of the unfortunate hatred and trolls and other stuff that is out in social that is, still kind of the dark underbelly of the channel.
Today's growth story centers around Exactly, a SaaS company that helps enterprise companies with their incentive compensation. They'd worked with search marketing agencies in the past, but they'd had issues with transparency and ROI. They wanted to improve net new leads via their organic and paid search channels, so they reached out to Directive. Optimizing search engine market share for Exactly was the top priority. Directive did this by improving search engine visibility for target audiences at the bottom of the funnel. In order to generate qualified leads, they focused on value-driven content on relevant, winnable terms, landing page testing on PPC platforms, and a laser focus on third-party directory optimization, specifically Capterra. Directive grew sales-accepted lead volume by 100%. Increased Capterra conversion volume by 336%, and boosted pre-qualified clicks to Capterra by 39%. If you're looking for results like this with your search engine marketing, there's a good chance Directive can help. Visit directiveconsulting.com and get a free customized proposal. All right, let's get back to the show.
So many good pieces in there. I want to get practical for people and companies smaller than the ones you've built value into through your engagement there. In a smaller organization, social is often kind of tossed off over there to that individual. If you're lucky, it's a team. It's easily siloed. Like, how do we integrate it back in for specifically, for us, social and social engagement, even in a support type scenario, was all driven out of marketing. It was me, and then it was this gal that I hired, and we would do it together. And then we put someone on social full time, and now it's her, but she takes vacation, and like most humans get sick from time to time. And so we're trying to figure out how to rope customer service and customer success in there so people can get more timely responses. So I guess I have a bunch of questions here. I'll save the one that just occurred to me to get your reaction. Like, when a team is much smaller, do you have any tips or recommendations around that? Like, how do we integrate social? Like, how do we elevate it out if we're in a company smaller than a Humana or a Discover or a McDonald's?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting because small companies present different problems than big companies. The big company problem, certainly at McDonald's, was there were more than 1 million mentions every single day. How do you handle that? How do you hire enough people to handle that, right? Now, for a small company, even 10 or 20 mentions a day may be that same question of like, how do we handle this? Because your social media person probably has a lot of other things on his or her plate, and maybe is also your email person or your website person. So they're doing multiple things. I think the first thing to keep in mind is that it is still critical that you communicate with your customers, especially when they want to communicate with you. I mean, I always ask, and I have worked in small companies as well, and I think the thing that we have to remind ourselves is without customers, we don't have a business. So there is nothing more important than communicating, than talking with our customers, especially when they want to talk with us. So in terms of prioritizing work, I would tell the social media person, forget about your next Facebook campaign and answer that customer's question, because that's more important. Right? I think that's one piece. The second thing is that it's really important just to set expectations for your customers, because people are generally very accepting of smaller companies and understanding that they're not 24/7 like an airline or like a hotel chain, right? But you do have to come out in front of it and on your profile pages say, hey, we're here to service you from 9 to 5 or whatever. And if it's after 5, we'll get back to you first thing in the morning. And people totally understand that. It's when you sort of either don't set expectations or set the wrong expectations. For example, if I tweet you at 2:00 in the morning and you've got somebody answering, then the next time I tweet at 2:00 in the morning, I'm assuming somebody's answering, right? And so you almost want to not do that and wait until 9 a.m. And now you've set the expectation with me that you're going to get back to me in business hours. And so it's absolutely fine. I often get asked do we have to be 24/7? And for most businesses, the answer is no. I mean, obviously, if you're an international airline and people are flying 24/7 and are having problems, yeah, you got to be there. But for most companies, that's not the case. The other question I get asked all the time is, well, what channels do we have to be in? And my answer is, I'm going to tell you ahead of time, is somewhat disappointing. It is wherever your customers are. And so when I was working on a Medicare Advantage product that aimed at seniors, we weren't on Snapchat because that's not where seniors are, but we sure as heck were on Facebook, right? And so your business may be very highly focused on Snapchat because that might be where your customers are, in which case you've got to be there. And if not, then don't worry about not being there. There is a lot of companies, big and small, make the mistake of feeling like they have to be everywhere. And then all that does is stretch your one person too thin. And so I would say focus on where your customers are, the 1 or 2 channels, and set expectations. And remember that not only are we nothing without our customers, but it is a whole lot easier to keep an existing customer than it is to acquire a new one. And yet, when you look at the dollars spent and the focus given to sales and acquisition and marketing versus customer success and customer service and retention, in almost any size business, it's way off. And so I think that's the other piece of advice I would give, is that this term customer success, I have some skepticism about, because I've been in a customer success role. And to me, it felt a little more like inside sales than it did really making my customers successful. But I do think that is a critical role, because when your customers are successful, then you don't have to sell as much because they're going to renew and they're going to stay and they're going to be loyal to you.
Yeah, really good stuff there. And you tackled the other question I had, which was about, it was really about expectations. So it wasn't the language I was going to use, but your customers, when they reach out through these, let's just call them, even though it's ridiculous to do so in 2019, alternative channels, alternative to email, chat, phone, that they have an expectation, but you have the opportunity to manage it and set it. And as long as you're clear and explicit, what they can expect in this channel, then this idea of being on 24/7, for me, it was like, what is the urgency of response? Because earlier you talked about this asynchronicity where you as a customer can tweet, and then, a while later you check in and there's your response or your answer. Like, how urgent does it need to be? So that was awesome. That's really, really good practical stuff. Let's talk about your podcast a little bit. You also have a customer experience based podcast. It's called Experience This. It's a very fun format. It is not, I run a very traditional format where I bring on really smart people and ask them questions that either A, I need or want the answers to, or B, I think the listeners would really enjoy and really evoke this theme and build this ongoing conversation. You have something that's a little bit more timely, topical, back and forth. You do it with Joey Coleman, who wrote his book on the topic you concluded that last response with. Talk about what you're trying to do with Experience This.
Yeah, so we are about to enter our 4th season of Experience This, and it has been a ton of fun to do. And I hope and I think that comes out in the product, is that Joey and I really have a lot of fun doing the show. And we looked at the whole show top to bottom and said we want to do something different. If we're going to talk about creating remarkable experiences, we need to create an experience for our listeners. We need to do something that is extraordinary, that's a little bit better than ordinary, or just different from ordinary. And I actually, previous to Experience This, did host another podcast that was an interview show. And so I love listening to interviews of smart people and learning from them as well. So it's not that there's a knock on that format. It's just simply that we wanted to intentionally do something different. So what we landed on was essentially a roughly 25 to 30 minute episode that's broken into 3 different segments. And I like to compare it to, if you remember the Price is Right game show, they have like 15 different games, but they only play 5 or 6 games in every episode. And so you never even quite know what game you're going to get. And that's exactly what we do. So we have about 10 different segment types, but we only use 3 in every episode. And so you don't even know which of the 10 you're going to get. So every episode feels different. It's not, there's not, it's sort of, if you can't fall asleep at the wheel because the next episode's going to be something really different. The shorter format segments also of like 7, 8, maybe 10 minutes allow for just sort of a quicker discussion that's really lively, really interesting, really doesn't lull at all because you're sort of getting to the point, and then we move on and we capture a takeaway so that it's really important to us that there's a concrete takeaway from every story that we tell that is practical, that people can kind of go back to work and be like, hey, I heard this great story and here's how it would affect our business. And I've said the word story now a couple times too. I think we also try to focus on storytelling. I think the best way to get people interested in customer experience or enthused about doing something at their own business is just to tell them stories that are memorable, that are practical. I personally try to stay away from stories that might be amazing, but are so outlandish that a typical company couldn't possibly do it, right? It's like, most companies aren't going to spend $500,000 on, one customer and just to get the PR value out of it, right? So we really try to focus on stories that are practical. And one of my favorite parts about the show is that a lot of the stories now are coming from our listeners. So we have this ability, we have like a digital voicemail kind of thing where you can leave a recording of a story of your own experience. And so then we bring on these other voices, not as an interview, but as just sort of a snippet where we have Sally tell her story for 2 minutes and then Joey and I kind of riff on it and come up with the takeaways. So it's definitely fun. And we've had a blast doing it. And we're going to keep doing it as long as people want to listen to it.
Well, the way you opened, it absolutely does come through. It's just, it's got a contagious effect. And so I love that customers are interacting, or customers are listening and participating with it directly. It's great. And I'm excited that you talk about the season approach just really quickly. What's the approach from a season? It's just, you guys have commitments and you're like, okay, we need some periodic breaks to breathe and round up some new stuff and take care of other things? Or
yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think the other part is that we've gotten used to, as consumers, we've gotten used to sort of binging on seasons of content, whether it's on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever it is. Our first season was 40 episodes long, and it was a bear just to do every week for 40 weeks. And I think we found just personally that towards the end of that, we were getting exhausted, and we didn't want that to come out in the show. I still think the content was great, but it was just a struggle for us to get geared up for it. So we took a little break, and then we moved to 16 episode seasons, which actually, although it wasn't intentional, we kind of follow the school year. So we go from January to May, and then we take the summer off, and then we come back in September and we go through December, take maybe a week or 2 off for winter break and come right back in January and go through May again. So right now we're on hiatus over the summer, and it's great. We can focus on our own things. We can do something else. We can collect stories so that when we come back in the fall, we got a nice backlog of fun stories to talk about. And so far, that's worked really well. And 16 episodes seems to be, I'm not exactly sure how we came up with 16. I think it was more of a calendar thing, 4 months. It just worked pretty well for us. So we're going to keep doing it.
Awesome. Again, it's called Experience This with an exclamation point. And even the exclamation point comes through in the listen, and the 4th season's coming soon. I noticed, obviously, I like to read about guests when I can. I try to read some of their blog posts or read books or listen to the episodes. I had been listening to Experience This prior to reaching out to you to come on this show anyway.
Well, thank you.
Sure. And thank you for doing it. And I'm glad you're finding the rejuvenation you need to get back at it again, because it's a pleasure to listen to. But one of the things I noticed is that you have a background in a couple of prestigious schools. You did communication and psychology at Penn, which are the 2 subjects I studied most at the University of Michigan. And you did your MBA at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, one of the best in the world. Before we get into maybe the value of that experience, talk about the perceived value of that experience. I feel like a higher education, formal education are a little bit under attack, in part by this hustle culture that's like, who needs that? You just need to get out there and get it done and all of that. And then also, of course, the more practical consideration of, the fact that the cost of it is rapidly outpacing, the cost of inflation, et cetera. Talk about your thoughts at a very high level about formal education.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll tell you, I've been interviewed on a lot of podcasts and I've never been asked that. So this is an answer that has never been heard before. So I love the question. First of all, I would say, and I think a lot of people would say, I probably couldn't get into Penn today. It's so much more competitive, even than when I was there. But I ended up going to Penn really because, first of all, they let me in. But as I was looking at schools, I stepped on the campus and it was just one of those moments where I was like, this is where I belong. I love this place. I visited lots of college campuses. They're all beautiful. There wasn't really any that I hated, but I just stepped on that campus and I loved Philly. And I was like, this is where I got to go. And it was an amazing experience for me. I spent, my biggest extracurricular was the newspaper. And so I really got into journalism and knowing that it wasn't something I wanted to do for a career, but honestly, the skills that I developed as a writer and an editor have really helped me through my career in its entirety. People still know today that if they've got a spelling or grammar error in a Word document or a PowerPoint, I'm the one that's going to find it just because it's going to pop off the page and punch me in the face, whereas other people will skip it. Funny story, by the way, I actually had a vendor come to present to me at Discover and they spelled Discover wrong on the cover page of their presentation. And you can probably bet that I wasn't really giving them the benefit of the doubt for the rest of the presentation. And I think Kellogg was an awesome experience as well. And I do think that there is a lot of value in an MBA in the sense of it just rounding out the other areas of business that maybe you're not as comfortable on, right? So I came into Kellogg and left Kellogg as a marketer. But being exposed to finance and statistics and economics and some of these other things that, marketers often get a bad rap. They're, it's the soft skill and they don't really understand numbers and all that thing. And so I really enjoyed kind of learning some of that other stuff. And ironically, the required classes that I had to take in my first year, there were 11 of them. And the one that I waited to take last because I was absolutely convinced I was going to hate was operations. And I took operations and I loved it. And it actually turned out to be my second major behind marketing at Kellogg because I thought it was so fascinating. And I do credit that to sort of my interest in customer service and customer experience was taking some of those operations classes that just never would have, I think, crossed my mind. I would say, however, that what you said is true, that I think the value of the quality of the school that you went to is not as high as it used to be. And I think that MBAs have become arguably what law degrees became a couple decades earlier. They've sort of become a dime a dozen that everybody has an MBA now. And that could be frustrating to me. I don't think it really is, because I think that the education is still important and whether you got it at Kellogg or you got it at some school I've never heard of, I don't think is that critical. I'm obviously proud of where I went, but I do think that as I've progressed in my career, where I went to school has become less and less important. And it's funny, my dad said to me when I graduated college, he said, the first job you get, they're going to ask for your GPA in college, and then nobody else is ever going to care. And he's right. Nobody's ever asked me since then my GPA at Penn, and nobody, including my first job after business school, ever asked for my GPA at Kellogg. So it really doesn't matter. The details behind it don't really matter. I passed in both cases. I graduated. But I do think that the education part does matter. It helps you to be more well-rounded. It helps you to be a generalist in whatever role that you're in. And it helps you to really understand, especially when you're having debates with your colleagues or you're having big meetings with lots of differing opinions. It allows you to be more open-minded to, other people's perspectives.
Yeah, really good. You covered a lot of really important ground there and helped me organize a couple thoughts around it. One, I can absolutely see how operations would lend itself to a customer experience approach, in particular because it is interdisciplinary or cross silo or cross function, however you want to define that. And operations has that underlying element baked in. I think there's also an experience there. I mean, you got to it really there at the end a little bit because I agree. I mean, I've hired a number of people through my career, and if you went to a prestigious school and went really well, that's part of the holistic snapshot of you on paper. But ultimately, it's you in person. It's the accomplishments. It's the stories you're allowed that you can tell extemporaneously in an interview that really, and what other people say about you, reputation, right? Just to double back to social media and stories that people tell and experience. I do agree that it all adds together to make you a more well-rounded person in a lot of environments. But you mentioned, like, right off the bat, when I stepped on that campus, I knew this place was for me. I think my son had that same moment visiting Northwestern a couple summers back, but there's an experience there to being there in person. I did my MBA over 5 years. I dragged it out as long as I could to make it easier to pay for. And I opted not to do any classes online, because the school was, a 30-minute drive from my office. So I could get up there a couple weeknights every week. But there's something about that in-person experience, I think, that adds to the whole thing. Talk about it from an experiential standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, probably the best and most lasting impact of going to business school is the network that I created by being there. And one of the things that they do at Kellogg, and I'm sure there's some psychology behind this, but the first day you're there of orientation, the head of admissions stands up and basically tells you about your class. And in my class, there was, everybody short of curing cancer, right? There was the guy that spent 3 years in Africa, saving babies. And there was the other person that climbed Mount Everest. And there was the other person and it was like, oh my gosh, you just kept feeling smaller and smaller because these people had done unbelievable, remarkable things. And that's really the takeaway was just, it was such an experience to be in a room, not where you feel like the smartest person in the room, but where you feel like everyone's the smartest person in the room. And they're all kind of challenging you to think differently. I remember one project that we were on, a group project where I was there. It was a marketer. The person next to me was a teacher. The person next to them was from the military. The person next to them, was from the medical industry or whatever. And here we are all trying to solve the same problem, bringing our unique experiences together to solve it. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And you don't get enough of that in the work world because oftentimes it's a very homogeneous population versus being in that, trying to solve a complex business case sitting next to a doctor, was really, really interesting to me.
It's great. And it leads into the way I always like to close the show here, because I know you have a call at the top of the hour. So I want to honor that. Relationships are our number one core value here at BombBomb. We're all about that human connection, the relationship, the give and take, and everything that comes through that. So I like to give you the chance to thank or mention someone who's had a positive impact on your life or career, and to give a shout out to a company that you respect for the way that they treat customers.
Cool. Well, I'm going to give a shout out to my friend and mentor, Shep Hyken, who is a customer service guru, who I like to call my brother from another mother because we share the same hairdo. And when we're walking side by side, it's a pretty funny sight. But Shep has, he's a Hall of Fame speaker. He's been in the business for 30 plus years, and he has been so generous with his time and his mentorship and really helping me along in this business, which I think everybody needs. Everybody needs a mentor. I've tried to be a mentor to as many people as I can and throughout my career, but it is always nice when you get one for yourself. So I want to thank Shep for that. And the company right now that I am absolutely obsessed with is called Imperfect Produce, and it's a startup out of San Francisco. They are essentially taking what they call ugly fruit and vegetables, that stuff that isn't pretty enough to go into grocery stores, and they've created a subscription program out of it. And what I think is so remarkable about it is that not only is it a great value where I'm getting might be sometimes really large cucumbers or really small apples or whatever, or dents or bruises. it's really high quality fruit and vegetables at a great price. But the other part that they're so good at is that they help me measure on the website in real time. They tell me how many pounds of waste I've saved from the landfill and how much water I've saved because of that, and how much CO2 I've kept out of the air. And it's really an interesting way of keeping the customer hooked, because you understand your own contribution, your own value back. Plus, they have hilarious marketing. They're so clever. Their billboards are funny. The boxes they ship the stuff in are really creative. So I think they've really figured out how to take something as strange as ugly fruit and turn it into a fantastic experience.
So good. And what they're doing there is tying you into something bigger. It's bigger than me and the fruit I may or may not want to eat for the way it looks, and getting over that. But this idea of like you are part of something bigger when you participate with us, such a powerful ad. Dan, this has been awesome. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate your time so much. For folks that want to, and by the way, I learned about imperfect fruit?
Produce. Imperfect produce.
Imperfect produce. Sorry. I learned about that from Experience This. So if someone wants to connect with you or the podcast or your book or anything, how can people follow up if they enjoyed any aspect of this conversation?
Sure. Well, definitely come see me on my website at dangingiss.com. It's GINGISS. And there's links to everything there, book, podcast, speaking, etc. I'm also very active on Twitter, and not surprisingly, since I'm a social media guy. So that's at dgingiss, and I love to engage. I practice what I preach. So if you reach out to me, I promise I'll respond, and generally pretty quickly. And then Experience This is available wherever you listen to this podcast or any other podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, your favorite podcast app. We should be on it. And if not, reach out to me and I'll make sure that we get on it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and really appreciated all the stories you're able to share with us here.
Thank you. I appreciate the great questions and for really pushing me. It was fun.
Cool. Continued success to you.
Take care.
I love that concierge approach from her dentist's office and everywhere else it can be applied. If you want more useful customer experience ideas and conversations, check out the Customer Experience Podcast. You can find it in Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. You can also check out episode summaries, video clips, and a whole lot more at BombBomb.com/podcast. My name is Ethan Beute, and thanks again for listening to the B2B Growth Show.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.